So we've allocated quite a bit of time for this because it's actually probably the function that's closest to issues that we kind of deal with, technology issues. So let's kick it off and give you a time and you can go over a little bit.
Okay. All right, good morning. Protecting systems. I like to frame it in terms of how do we reduce the chance that something damaging is going to happen. And damaging really depends on the context of the customer, right? Jim mentioned the barber shop, right? Cybersecurity damage to a barber shop is quite different than cybersecurity damage to, let's say, a hospital. Operating rooms, right? Think about that for a moment, right? So what's really important is that we start by thinking about why we're protecting these systems. What are we trying to, although you may think of building automation systems as being just the heat, right, or just the air conditioning, for many facilities, the building automation systems are becoming mission critical. The hospitals are a great example of that. But even something like a restaurant, if your building automation system isn't working properly, the customers may not want to dine at your facility and you'll lose a lot of revenue. You may not be able to cook the food if the conditions within the kitchen are intolerable. So these systems really are mission critical, and eventually the bad guys are going to figure this out, and we will become targets. But I think that it's also important, as Jim Lee mentioned in his introduction, to think about lateral attacks. These systems are becoming interconnected more and more, especially as building automation systems move towards using IP protocols. And when that happens, attacks to building automation systems can be stepping stones to attacks to other systems. And likewise, attacks on other systems can become stepping stones to attacks on building automation systems. So the interconnectivity that we enjoy in order to make our life easier when we deploy our systems can also come back to bite us. It's great. It's convenient to be able to hop on that IT network to get from building to building. But we are exposing ourselves to more risk, and we're also exposing other systems to more risk when we take advantage of that interconnectivity. So I think that we can all agree that at this point, protecting the heat and the air conditioning really is something that we should take seriously. But what should we protect? And I'd like to go back to what Steve was saying in his identify piece. It's really important for us to understand what we have. What are our assets? These assets include not only the workstations and the controllers, but also the network infrastructure that supports them. We need to know what those assets are. And you might or might not be surprised that when I go in to talk to big enterprise customers, often universities, the people that actually have to maintain and operate the systems don't know all of what they have. They have a general idea, but really don't know where all the assets are. And it's hard to protect things that you don't know about. Fundamentally, right? So you need to know what assets make up the BAS, and this isn't just the obvious things, but also all the supporting infrastructure. Physically, where are those assets? And of course, since I'm a BACnet guy, I'm very interested in how those Now, if you go into a big enterprise customer, to prioritize the activities that we use to protect all of these assets. And how do we do that? A risk assessment is really a first step. What am I most worried about? If I'm a barber shop, if I'm a restaurant, if I'm a hospital, what are the risks? And what's the impact if there's a breach? That's fundamental to figuring out how we should go about protecting these systems. Know where the biggest risks are to the mission of the organization that's inhabiting the facilities. So, the NIST Framework gives us kind of a menu of things that we can do to protect systems. And one reason that Anto gave us time about protection is because it is a pretty broad topic, and we think about it more and more in the building automation industry, and probably more than the other main functions in the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. That isn't to say that the other functions aren't important. They are very important, and they're going to be more and more part of our lives. But I would like to go briefly through these 6 areas that the NIST framework defines. We'll talk about each one of them, and then we have a great panel that has a lot more experience than I do in actually protecting systems, and I hope you'll have some questions for them about these topics. And by the way, I am going to mention BACnet SC somewhere in here too, but I don't want this to be about BACnet SC. That's just one part of how we can protect our automation systems. So let's start with identity management and access control. We've already talked a little bit about passwords and how you need to, for example, the problem of identity management and access control is really much bigger than that. For example, we have all these autonomous devices running around in our systems. Right? The fundamental things was we wanted to be open. We wanted to make it easy for people to connect devices, for devices to interoperate with each other. So in reality, this means that in virtually all BACnet systems today, if I have physical access to and it can start doing stuff on that network, right? So devices need to have identity. There need to be access controls around what devices can do, not just what human users can do through some sort of a user interface. Awareness and training. I know that in our organization, we often get questions from employees. Now, I got this email that says that I need to go to this website in order to reset my password or to look at my the amount of storage that's been allocated to my email because it's running out. You know, how do I distinguish? And in an organization of our size, you know, we know everyone in the company. So we have a pretty good idea of whether an email that we got was legitimate or not. But in larger organizations with more sophisticated attacks, how do your users know what is legitimate, what is not legitimate? So awareness and training is really important. We need general awareness of the kinds of cybersecurity risks that we face, not just in operating our building automation systems. Because of these lateral attacks, right? If someone gets into my account, let's say through a phishing attack on my email, now they can potentially hop over and attack other systems using my credentials. Not good, right? So we need general awareness of cybersecurity issues, but also for people who directly interact with building automation systems, we need role-specific training. What do they need to do as a part of? Next, data security. Okay, so why do we need to focus on data security? Well, first of all, data is important to operating these systems. If data is corrupted, either intentionally or unintentionally, these systems will fail to operate in the way that we expect them to. Data inside the devices, but also for us BACnet people, we are concerned very much about protecting data as it moves throughout a network. And in some cases, privacy might be part of this. Confidentiality of data. For the military, they're interested in keeping the data, how to put it, obscure to any potential attackers for other reasons. So data security is obviously important, and that's one. Next, information protection processes and procedures. We've talked about the need for process. We don't have very much of it in our industry that is implemented routinely, regularly. Backups have been mentioned. We need to back up these systems so that we can restore them in case of a breach or in case some other incident occurs that causes data to be lost, device configurations to be corrupted. Another aspect of information protection processes is how devices are configured. There are ways to configure devices that are better than others from a cybersecurity standpoint. Large organizations working with their vendors need to come up with standard device configurations that have passed muster with the people who are responsible for IT security. Maintenance, sensors and actuators in our business, but software needs to be maintained too. And any of us who I should say, use Windows PCs are familiar with Microsoft's updates that come routinely. And by the way, they're free, right? We buy a license to Windows 10, and we get free updates for the life of Windows 10. What happens to the BAS industry? Carol, does JCI provide free firmware updates for the life of a controller? All right, it's a loaded question.
You might pay someone to put it in, right?
Yeah.
It goes to the device, because it's not like a regular PC in general.
Right. So, in general, software updates are not free, but we know that we're going to need them for building automation systems. And the vendors are used to charging either directly for the patches themselves or at least for the time of a technician to install them properly. So we have yet another dichotomy between standard IT and building automation that we have to bridge somehow, because users increasingly are going to expect that we are going to patch their systems for the life of those, right? So how are we going to reconcile these conflicting expectations between users and vendors? Or as Jim Lee put it succinctly, who's going to pay, right? So maintenance goes beyond that. We need to keep track of who's doing work on the system, make sure that they have the proper authorization to do work on the systems, that they're using tools that are appropriate for working on these systems from a cybersecurity standpoint. So maintenance is obviously a big issue, and we don't have the answers yet as to how we're going to move into this cyber world. And finally, protective. These technologies are designed to keep our systems secure and resilient. That's the goal, really. So audit logs have been mentioned before. We can have a lot of information that maybe isn't relevant. So we have to think about what we're logging and how we're going to look at these logs. Otherwise, they'll be write only. They'll go into some hole somewhere and won't be useful at all. Right? Network security controls. How many of you have heard of network security controls before? Okay, an increasing number. I'm becoming familiar with network security controls too, because our enterprise customers are saying to us, well, Jim, there's this thing called NIST 800-53 Rev 4. Which security controls does your product implement? Okay? These are great documents that NIST has put forward, and although they were intended for the government, they're coming into our world too, even when we're not selling. And frankly, they're quite useful. They're tools that we can use to communicate with IT about how our products work from a cybersecurity standpoint. So I think that we're going to see more and more of this coming from our commercial customers. And by the way, if you don't give us good answers to those questions, you can't connect to our network, right? More and more of that we're seeing. Okay, finally, I want to talk a little bit about BACnet SC, since that's probably the thing that I know the most about in this whole subject area. Why is it useful? Why is it part of your protection strategy going forward? Well, we talked about the need for devices having an identity. BACnet SC gives all devices an identity in the form of a digital certificate. That identifies the device. The certificate is also signed by a certificate authority for a particular site. And that signing process allows the device to connect to a BACnet SC network. So we've gone from a world in which credential, just like users of the IT systems, need to have a proper credential network. Another feature of BACnet SC, perhaps a less important one for most users, is that all of the traffic is going to be encrypted. I don't want to say much more about BACnet SC because, of course, I'm way over time on my prepared remarks. So what I'd like to conclude with is that protection is a big subject. You need to know what you need to protect. A good way to do that is through a risk assessment. And now we have a group of experts who have more experience with this. Thank you very much.
All of that stuff, and I'm sure many of you are. This is a lot in cybersecurity, but I think these two first functions, the identify and protect, are probably the most relevant to a lot of the technologies that we have to deal with. So again, what's your experience in terms of how sensitive are they to all of these issues that we talked about in the identifying?
Customers is a great, and I've seen a couple of examples that we've already said. I think Steve said a very good one about the device that would wipe itself after it had been, so many failed attempts. And typically within our own personal lives, when a piece of technology or a requirement comes to us like that, an immediate reaction is, oh, that's a pain, right? That's going to make my life more difficult because there's a chance I could forget my password, and then my phone's going to erase itself, or my device is going to erase itself, or whatever. And once you go past that and say, well, look, this is the reason why. This is the reason why we're going to enable that function, is because someone can use a password, brute force piece of software, and they can try and get into your phone, and that's what stops that. And then you kind of sit back and go, well, okay, I understand that now. I understand the reason why we need that. And I think quite often when I think the industry's been a little bit lackadaisical in not really communicating the real end benefit of why we need a lot of these cybersecurity pieces in place. We all know from our history of looking under the keyboard to find a username and password, and pretty much that was every site I went to in the 90s. We have moved along. This industry has changed. Where we're in the next level is really communicating the benefits. Why we're putting this in. Why do we put these password protection places in? Why do we make you change it once a month? You think that once a month is too much, too much. Why are we doing that? Why are we putting that there? And our reaction, our feedback from our customers has been once they understand the why, they're a lot more receptive to it. They're a lot more to bring it on board and make it part of their processes. And it's been said a couple of times by everyone on this panel that this is a people issue. This isn't really a technology issue. The technology already exists. This is to get people to change things that they've always done in a certain way. And I know with my own family, I'm rambling on here, but again, another real world experience of when I implemented a password management tool for my family, the immediate resistance was, we got to have unique passwords for every website, and they've all got to be,
Then bring in 2FA.
And then 2FA, but again, once you explain why you're doing it, the family go, okay, we get it, because it's everywhere, and all of a sudden, you've got identity theft, you've got credit issues, and you've got a whole world of pain that you don't want to do, or use this app. What do you want to do? Where do you want to be? Right? Where do you want to spend your time trying to fix the problem? And I do think that 2FA, two-factor authentication, I think that's come along a lot, and I think we're going to start to see in this industry us using the mobile devices a lot more. We use our devices not just for phones and email. We use these things to do banking, transactions. We use the authentication that we have with this, either face or fingerprint or whatever, to access those sensitive systems. We now need to go to the next stage where we link those into the enterprise so that perhaps to log on to the BMS, to make a change on the BMS, I've also got to authenticate via this. I think that's going to be the next step. And it's a logical step because I think people, we all touch these things like 400 times a minute. So getting someone to play with their phone a bit more is quite an easy thing to do.
Dave, are you seeing in at KMC people starting to understand the benefits? I think that's an excellent point.
We still have to inculcate with our customers to make sure that they're really part of the game and to help train them. This is what they're going to be talking to with the building owners and the IT departments and that, and just to really sit down and become more and more part of that team and understand that they want to be part of that team. It really takes a team effort to make it up security.
You have a question? Can you come up to the microphone, please? Did you want to make a quick
in the way when customers think about securing passwords for just the management system or at device level. So for device level and applies security, but for the management systems, people care. So I see this definitely see that.
So,
okay. If you're familiar with the target hit years ago, could that have happened if they had not tied into the server that supplied the cash register? In other words, the analogy I would use, if you're familiar with double check valves and air brake backflow preventers, air brake is a very positive stop. There's no doubt about it. My kids wouldn't have been poisoned when they were little at school trying to cook with. Double check valve does not stop these problems. I could cite chapter and verse as opposed to a pod gotten into the system. I don't know enough details.
So there's actually there are a lot of mistakes that happen with target. One was the attacker was able to find VPN credentials on another organization's network, and then once they were able to use those, everything was open. So the network wasn't segregated, so they could then get access to everything. So like one of the key lessons learned from Target was segregate your network into zones, so that if somebody breaks in, they don't have access to everything.
For my house, right? But he barks at everybody that goes by. So they kind of like treated that as Just
Another
ignore it.
alarm, yeah.
Ignore it, right?
Yeah.
It's really bothering us. So that was another big thing, that they did not use some of the bells and whistles they had to protect them.
Well, having been in Afghanistan and Baghdad, let me tell you, there's some smart folks out there that can make very good IEDs, can take dry ice and put it in a mortar, put the mortar in on top of it, let it melt down, they're long gone. So, I mean, there's a lot of creative folks, unfortunately, doing the wrong things. And I'm sure it applies in this case as well. I don't know how idiot-proof you can make it, but anyway, that was my
Thank you. Could you come up, please? Just one point while it's coming up. You were talking about different zones, right? I presume there's kind of two types of different zones. There's physical zones and virtual zones in networks.
Sure.
It's probably, just sort of raising it because we use these kind of words, but there's actually in cyber and IT world, they care more about the virtuals. The virtual
They're called VLANs.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
so
But
there's
my point is just by the use of the word zones,
sure.
I'm not sure that's clear because people think about zones.
And when I think when I said zones, I'm referring to the way ICS cert recommends people build their network, and sometimes they're physical network zones that are segregated from other physical network zones, and they're not necessarily using VLANs, although a lot of people are using VLANs.
Right. And
My point is that in this industry, we think about zones because there are air zones and stuff like that.
Sure.
That word can be
Right, a little bit
Sure. Yep.
connotation.
right. So,
And I think as far as how it applies to the protect side of things, that's going to add on that is the segmentation of your networks. Put your building automation systems on fully separate systems. A hacker were to use that as a attack vector, that they don't have access to the other part of the infrastructure's IT systems. They're even stating that now recently, homes should start doing this as well. Put your smart TVs, your smart devices, your cameras on separate systems and do the multi-factor, because you don't want somebody watching and talking to your kid now, or to your dog or whatever that's happened with Ring here. But the segmentation, from what I understand with this industry, is probably the biggest as an IT manager for my company, is having these systems separated so that if there's not firmware updates, there's not that happening on those embedded systems, that they can't be used as attack vectors or vice versa or something. If a guest network was compromised, they don't have access to the HVAC systems that shut off the fans to a room or something like that.
So you raise a really good point. This comes on when we have that discussion about risk. And some people are scared of those words, but you should say, well, what if I got hacked? What can I do to mitigate it? What can I do to either prevent it or lessen the impact? And VLANs are one thing. Some people even use a managed switch, and it goes down certain ports, so you can't communicate with port 80. It's only 443 or something. So there's a lot of things you can do, and again, you have to have that discussion with your IT department and facility managers to see what fits your mission. Extra good.
yes. Come.
I can ask from here, I'm loud. So we're really blessed to have students from local colleges here, from IT departments and HVAC programs. And there's a lot of wisdom in this room, a lot of brilliance. What
Right.
one thing would your panel give them advice today if we have IT students wanting to understand our industry sitting right here? What would you tell them?
That's a fantastic question.
My biggest takeaway, because I did go back to school for a couple of IT degrees, and I interned at an IT shop. So I'm a mechanical engineer, I worked always in engineering, and I had to have about 100 hours of interning. And I thought, oh, okay, this will be easy. And there were some things I thought about. They do different, making the drawings of the racks of servers and identify what's in there. So they were a pretty good shop. They did have a way for the weekend service tech to find out the password to the Toyota car dealer that he had to go and update their patch for automobile parts, you know, so, I mean, it's really applicable. So it showed me that there are processes and procedures that these guys follow. We don't yet do it in our world, but we need to start home.
Awesome, so you got out of your comfort zone and you went out and learned something completely different.
Right.
Excellent.
And I'll add on to this, I love the student space.
Thank you.
I wish I could, well, some days I wish I could get back just without studying and homework, but, you know, yes, there's a lot of smart people in this room, there's a lot of smart
And
people
we
in
can
this.
connect you with students. We can get you in that classroom real easy.
Well, thanks for the segue, because that's really what I wanted to talk about, because there's a lot of smart people in the room, there are a lot of smart people at the show, but it doesn't have to end on Wednesday. I would say the biggest thing you could do over these next few days is connect with people, whether they're technology firms, or services firms, or IT related, or HVAC related. Go talk to some of these people, find out about their technology, ask questions. A lot of professionals in this room recognize that there is a major deficit in technical understanding of cyber as well as the industry as a whole. Connect, ask, and that's your best ticket to finishing your academics and then getting into industry.
I'm wondering how many companies, controls vendors or channel actually bring in interns, especially what you're describing as IT interns?
Yeah, we're working with all of them. I mean, we got
Okay.
interns being planted everywhere, but we're also working to bring your expertise into sound bites into the classroom. Because you can't be in every classroom, but we need your brilliance there too.
I would give you one more point, which is that brilliance and sitting on a panel, all that stuff is interesting, but there's probably not a person, and recognizing that and approaching those people that way, because I can tell you, people that spend half their life on the roof know things the rest of us don't. It's really important stuff to know when you're trying to understand the whole context, so you can be effective.
Great point.
Another thing I'll add is, I think we could probably all agree on this panel, we're all still learning. Technologies continue to change. Cybersecurity threats continue to change. And so I would just encourage those who are students to really understand what's out there and realize that the learning process doesn't end once that degree finalizes. You're going to be learning for life.
I'd like to just build again on what everyone's saying here, but the IT industry is, from an education perspective, you tend to come at it from that side of the world, how IT thinks about cyber. And this world, building controls, is very different. And you got to get in the shoes of the people in this room to really understand the differences. There's a recent publication called 8228. It's about 50 pages long. It's really exciting stuff. But this came out last summer and really summarized the differences in trying to solve the cyber challenge in this world versus the IT world. And it's a quick, relatively speaking, read, because they summarize it nicely in the beginning of the document. That would be a good starting point to help frame the challenge.
What's the link?
8228, NIST. Just Google it, you'll find it.
Hey, Evan, looked at what she said. How many folks are near campus so that you can come in and do it?
Not a problem.
We can talk offline,
Yep.
but, you know, I'm sure there's people in cities very easy to bring in. And there's also, different, organizations, I'm sure just about every big city that could also come in.
Let's turn to BACnet SC, which is clearly core to, from our perspective, part of Protect. It's now an addendum as of November, right? So it's been released, yay. And I think the challenge now is to get it implemented. And maybe Andy, you can sort of speak a little bit about how you're helping drive the implementation of SC.
Sure, so BACnet SC is another data link, right? It's a choice. You can have BACnet IP or MSTP, or you can have SC, depending on what your needs are and what your suppliers can do for you. So implementing SC is not like implementing all of BACnet. It's implementing a new data lake layer, but it has some constructs that don't exist in the existing BACnet standards, so people need to learn about it, and the first people that need to learn are the people that build products. So the Interoperability Acceleration Program that we put together was a collaboration among suppliers and a couple of the experts who helped to write that document to rapidly how it works. So in the context of their own products, they can either implement it, or if they license it from somebody else, they can support it when their customers start to use it. Because like a couple of people have already mentioned, BACnet SC provides capability, but to take advantage of that capability, you have to have some process and structure around it. You never had to worry about certificates before in a building automation system, and now you do. Putting BACnet SC in only requires that you do. It doesn't solve the, but how do I do? And so that needs to be addressed as well. So the program we're working on is really focused on educating, providing reference implementation, right, real software that the suppliers who are involved can use, or just use as an example, or use for testing their own. And the expectation is a year or so after it's done there, it'll be open source, so anybody can do it. And that is the intent, really, is to drive technology that has to go in products as fast as you can. Because if you have that, the rest of it isn't going to help you.
So another specific question, maybe to Jim. You know, when I've mentioned BACnet SC to people, they kind of say, okay, so that means that all of the current devices out there are going to be upgraded. I think the answer is no.
Certainly not.
But how do you bring those thousands or millions of devices into?
Sure. So when you talk to your vendors about BACnet SC, I think that there are a couple of questions that you want to ask. First of all, when are they going to provide product? And second, what is their strategy for allowing you to upgrade your existing hardware and software to support BACnet SC? Now, in any big enterprise, or even a medium enterprise, there will continue to be MSTP networks and BACnet IP networks for the foreseeable future. And BACnet SC, as stated, is just another data link, just like MSTP is a data link. We connect BACnet SC networks to existing networks using BACnet routers, just like BACnet IP networks to BACnet MSTP networks using BACnet routers today. So there will be routers available from your vendors and from third-party suppliers that will allow you to make this transition gradually from existing systems to ones that have a little bit of SC, and maybe eventually to systems that use BACnet SC exclusively.
So in addition, you know, the question is if you've got an insecure network and you've got a secure network, what prevents people from contaminating the secure network through that router? And the answer is that those routers are going to have firewall capability built in. There'll be a series of rules in those routers that prevent rogue traffic on the unprotected side from getting through. That's my point.
So I think Jim mentioned that earlier that he doesn't think that BACnet SC is going to be being installed until probably 2 years down the road. Few controls companies on this panel. Is that optimistic? Is that realistic? What's kind of the timeline of people seeing BACnet SC in an actual project?
I think it's realistic that it'll take 1 to 2 years. And I think there's some hard choices to be made. Remember this model that we're following, that we usually don't get the right monies to upgrade a BAS system? Everybody thinks they can last for 20 years. So that's going to be another impediment. I'm not saying that it'll be in all cases, but I think we'll have to really work at, again, going through that risk assessment and see how does that enter mission, and then you might be able to get the more money, you know, if you're banking, and, you know, no one wants to know that you're running port 80, right? So, I think that'll help. But I still think, you know, it takes a couple of years sometimes for big buildings to come up out of the ground. So I think it'll be 1 to 2 years. There will be some immediate ones, right? There's
Some early
product available, but if you're talking about permeating the whole landscape.
as a norm, or the normal.
Yeah.
Yeah, so at Delta Controls, we actually launched it already. So technically, some of our customers could do it today. I think where it's going to take the time and the time frame that Jim mentioned of a couple of years, I think that's because it has to go through the consultants. So we got to go and educate why they should put it in specifications, what they should put in the specifications. I think that's what's going to take the time to get there next. So obviously that's incumbent upon us as manufacturers to go and do that legwork and make those calls, do those lunch and learns, and get BACnet SC specified with the consulting community.
And
Also from the market side, I believe there's 2 years to receive products within the time frame. At the same time, we talk about upgrading existing systems. My private opinion, my personal opinion is actually we will not see too many systems that get upgraded in reality.
Is that mainly because of sort of capacity of hardware, or
no?
What's the reason?
From our perspective, for the Logitech hardware, I don't see any reason why we should not allow upgrades from BACnet IP to BACnet SC. So this is not the question. But what I've learned in this industry is when you have a running system, you usually don't touch it anymore.
Leave it alone.
Never touch a running system. This is what I've learned in that industry. And there will be minor examples, some systems that will be upgraded, but I believe that most of the installed base will exist the way that it exists today. And for new installations and for new systems, we will see with all the education programs that needs to be added to all the technology, we will see installations of SC, I'm sure. But for the systems that are running since years, honestly, just leave it.
How about you,
I'm
Dave?
not saying just leave it. I see that
it's going to be left.
Only happen, you know.
It's going to be left.
Yes.
Yeah, we're planning to, about the same time frame, about 1 or 2 years, probably more like 2. But we, some of our products, we actually stress for the upgrade, continually upgrade all the time. We don't charge for that. I guess we're leaving money on the table. You're the new age, I guess. But no, I mean, it'll start out with, at a higher level, maybe at the router level, at the server level, and then eventually get down to the controller level. So it'll take time.
Kevin, you're slightly different because you're not a controller per se. But
Sure. So one of the things that our product does at Tritium is we connect to all protocols. And so, of course, we'll be supporting BACnet SC. The challenge, though, I think, as many people have said, is, I think a lot of the conventional wisdom for this community is, hey, it works, don't touch it. I don't want you to break it. And also just the long life of these devices, where you'll see some BACnet devices, some BACnet SC systems within the same network.
with routers.
But I think, I think some organizations, unless they're forced, or unless it is specified, may resist change for whatever reason. I think BACnet SC is a great stride forward, and I think it'll be super helpful for our community.
Okay. So Jim, one specific question for you. You, I believe, the guy that invented BBMDs. Is that going to continue to exist in SD-LAN?
Well, I'm not going to take folks. The answer is no. BACnet SC does not use BBMDs. There is a different function in BACnet SC that does some of the same things that BBMDs currently do today. That's more flexible than BBMDs. We think they'll be easier to manage, and I hope I won't hear too many BBM complaints.
Not so much about data security. We really haven't talked about that so much.
Question?
Good.
A couple of questions for data security.
Okay, that's great.
Perfect.
I'll state all of them and then go away.
No,
So,
if you can speak to the microphone.
oh, I'm sorry. Is that?
That's good.
As far as data security, are we stepping into the domain of classifying data? That's one to be clear cut, of course, but there's a grayscale there. The other question about encryption, which covers the data in transit.
Yeah.
Whereas at rest, are we relying on IT to secure the data at rest when it is stored and for processing? And the last question, which is tied to the identity management, are we also, as an industry, stepping into the domain of dealing with data as assets and control who to that data, who can modify the data, and who can delete the data? And so, does authentication and authorization applies to data as well, or no?
That's a lot of questions. A lot of
Yeah,
great questions. Maybe you want to stay up here so that you can remind us.
I can start. I think the EU's GDPR really forced us to have that conversation about what kind of data do we have, what are the privacy impacts, and I think because of that regulation and other similar regulations, I think vendors and manufacturers and products really had to really think about that and build that into the design. Kind of really a security redesign of our product a few years ago, and one of the things that we wanted to do was make it easier for our users to secure the product. So we used the philosophy of secure by default, and so part of that was encrypting sensitive data, and data encrypted at rest, and we've continued that process as well as rules with role-based access control and things like that. So really answering your question, so that the person managing our systems could say, all right, who has access to who has read access, who can view the data, who can modify the data, all that stuff. But because we have a product that's highly customizable, it is something that the system has to figure out what their policies are on that. So it's kind of a blend of what does the product provide, and then what are the policies of the organization using the products. And I think you'll see that across the board.
This starts to bring the sort of identify versus the protect, right? Because you have to identify what it is that's important to protect, and some may be more important than others, and therefore you can focus your efforts where it's needed.
Yeah, I'd like to add some context around the data privacy when taking the data out of the building. So what I'm seeing is that a lot of organizations today still, and that sort of flies in opposition to the way architectures are being designed for software. Increasingly, things are becoming cloud-based. So it's forcing this issue, it's forcing this whole conversation around, well, I want to go with the latest and greatest technology, and it's sitting up in the cloud in order for me to take advantage of cloud architectures, but the customer won't let the data come out of the building. So now what do you do, right? So we've got to, I think, as an industry, tackle this one and come up with methods that allow that data to go to the cloud in a secure fashion. So certainly encrypting the data is a piece of it. But then there's the access once it gets up there. How do you control who has access to it? It's sitting now in somebody's cloud. Who has access to that data ultimately in that cloud? How do you segregate the data? All of those issues are being asked by customers, which is probably why you're bringing the subject up. But this is an unresolved issue, and it's pressing because from what I'm seeing in the industry, all the major manufacturers who we're trying to sell them to So it's an area we really gotta tackle, and it's unresolved at this point. Gary?
Yeah, and, I think along those lines, one of the big pieces is authentication, right? We talked about LDAP and secure LDAP versus whether you use credentials or whether you're using two-step authentication versus true two-factor authentication. You know, we talk about data, whether it's data at rest or data at transit, or access to a cloud or a building's edge, it boils down to authentication. And I think we can all agree as an industry, we've done this very poorly. You know, the stories I've heard of, you know, the guy we let go 3 years ago, you know, he still uses his credentials to get into that building that he set up the first time, right? And it still happens today. And so from our standpoint, one of the big cyber pieces here, what we're going to do with integration contractors to lead with best practices, because until we set down good practices as an industry, that data piece is going to be left undetermined.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great question.